Mud to the knee, lantern light swinging on a nail. Emmett Kesler drove the shovel down again, and the barn floor swallowed the sound. Dust sifted from the rafters overhead like snow that forgot which season it belonged to. His hands were split at the knuckle, wrapped in feed-sack cloth, and still he dug. A rooster crowed at an hour with no business being crowed at. Somewhere past midnight, a stone gave way beneath his boot, and cold air breathed up out of the ground, air that smelled of iron and rain that hadn't fallen yet. Emmett knelt in that hole like a man listening for something buried deeper than dirt. He didn't call out. He didn't stop. He set the lantern on the lip of the pit, picked up the shovel again, and kept going while the house behind him sat dark and the fields lay quiet under a sky gone the color of a bruise. 31 days stood between him and the loss of everything his family had ever owned, and here he was, a foreclosed man, digging a hole in the ground instead of packing a truck. Whatever answer he was chasing, he wasn't telling a soul. If you've ever kept digging when everyone told you to quit, you already know how this story goes, so stay close, because it gets stranger before it gets good. Drop a comment and let me know what little corner of the map you're watching from tonight. I like picturing all the porches and kitchens this reaches. And if stories like this one feel like home to you, go on and subscribe. There's another family waiting behind every barn door. Tarrow County sat in the limestone folds of eastern Kentucky, the kind of country where the hills held onto fog until noon out of pure stubbornness. The Kesler place had been there since before the county had a courthouse to keep its deed and 60 acres of hay ground, a leaning barn, and a farmhouse with a tin roof gone the color of a dime left out in weather. Emmett's grandfather Ansel had built that barn with his own hands and sealed its floor with river rock nobody, in 3 generations, had ever thought to question or disturb. Emmett had held onto the place through 2 bad tobacco years, a mare that broke her leg in the spring mud, and a winter that took half his fence line down to kindling. His wife Sula kept the books at the kitchen table by lamp oil, adding the same numbers over and over as if repetition might change the answer. It never did. By spring, the columns simply stopped balancing, no matter how early she rose or how late she stayed up chasing them with a stub of pencil worn down to nothing. The bank in Ashcamp foreclosed on a Tuesday. Emmett remembered because it was trash day, and he stood at the end of the drive holding the certified letter next to his empty bin, feeling like both of them had just been emptied out. 31 days, the paper said, until the courthouse steps in town, until strangers could bid on 60 acres his grandfather had cleared by hand. He folded the letter twice, put it in his shirt pocket, and walked back up the drive without a word to anyone waiting at the window. What galled the county worse than the foreclosure itself was what came after. Instead of packing crates, Emmett started tearing into the barn floor with a mattock and a coal shovel. Cordell Hucks, who ran the feed store in town and considered himself a man of plain sense, drove out just to see it with his own eyes, boots crunching gravel he'd known since boyhood. "Emmett," he said, leaning against the door frame, "they's fixing to sell this place out from under you at the courthouse steps, and you're down there digging like a groundhog looking for Christmas." Sula didn't laugh at her husband, though plenty in town did behind cupped hands. Some nights, folding wash by lamplight while Emmett was still out at the barn, she wondered along with everyone else what had gotten into him. Her mother asked her over the party line, gentle as she could manage, whether Emmett was quite right in the head these days. Sula only said her husband had never once been a foolish man in 11 years of marriage, and she didn't aim to start doubting that now, letter or no letter, laughter or no laughter from the men at the feed store. Their boy Alden was 7 that spring, old enough to notice the whispering at church but too young to understand it. He took to sitting on an overturned bucket at the barn door some evenings, watching his father work, asking why Grandpa Ansel's old stories mattered more than the bank's letter. Emmett never answered directly. He'd just hand the boy a smaller shovel and let him fill a bucket or 2 before bed. the two of them working in a silence that said more than either could have put into words that spring. It started with a story Ansel used to tell, half memory, half tall tale, about a singing spring under the home place that had gone dry sometime before the Depression, when a flood shifted the creek bed and buried the old springhouse whole. Ansel always claimed the barn was built square over where that spring once ran, like a stone laid over a well to keep something from getting up and walking off. Emmett had heard the story 100 times as a boy at his grandfather's knee, and never once believed a word of it. 3 weeks before the sheriff's sale, sitting up with the redemption papers spread across the kitchen table, 31 days to raise enough money to buy the farm back before auction, or lose it forever, Emmett found himself thinking less about the number at the bottom of the page and more about his grandfather's voice, worn soft with age, telling that old story by the wood stove. He didn't sleep that night. Before sunup, he was already out at the barn, boots laced, lantern lit, staring down at floorboards he'd walked over 10,000 times without ever once looking down. He started digging the very next evening and didn't stop for anything short of chores and church. He didn't tell Sula exactly what he was hunting because he wasn't entirely sure himself. Some nights it felt like looking for water. Other nights it felt like looking for his grandfather. He hauled out 5 wheelbarrows of packed clay a night after supper, shoring the widening pit with fence posts scavenged from his own ruined line, working by lantern, because the barn had never once had power run to it in 70 years. Cordell came around twice more that first week, each visit more baffled than the last. "You do know," he said, leaning on the barn door one evening while Emmett hauled up another load of stone, "that a man can't pay off a bank note with a hole in the ground." "Didn't say I could," Emmett answered, and kept digging without breaking his rhythm. Cordell shook his head all the way back to his truck and told the whole counter down at the feed store the next morning that Kesler had finally lost the thread. The county clerk, a stiff, sour-faced man named Whitcomb Dre, stopped by under the excuse of confirming the property boundary, but really just to see the spectacle for himself. He stood at the barn door in his good shoes, notebook tucked under one arm, watching Emmett haul stone in the mud. "Some men fight a foreclosure with lawyers," Whitcomb said dryly. "You're fighting yours with a shovel." Emmett didn't look up. Whitcomb left shaking his head, telling anyone who'd listened down at the diner that Kesler had finally cracked wide open. 12 days before the sale, disaster came dressed as ordinary bad luck. A support post gave way in the night, and 8 feet of tunnel collapsed back in on itself, burying 2 nights' worth of work under a ton of red clay. Emmett stood over the cave-in at dawn, shovel hanging loose from one hand, and for the first time Sula saw something close to defeat cross her husband's face. He sat down right there on the barn floor, boots sinking in mud, and didn't move for the better part of an hour. It was Sula who broke the silence. She came out with 2 cups of chicory coffee, sat down beside him in the dirt in her good church dress without a word of complaint, and said only, "Your grandpa didn't dig this whole barn out by himself either, I'd wager." Then she picked up a spare shovel and started clearing fallen clay with her bare hands until Emmett, ashamed to sit idle while his wife worked, rose up and joined her without a word passing between them. They dug together after that, Sula in the evenings after supper dishes were done, their boy Alden hauling buckets too small for a boy his age but too proud to say so. 9 days out, they'd shored the tunnel 12 feet down, past River Rock, past a layer of old charred timber Emmett guessed was what remained of the original springhouse roof, burned or rotted sometime in his grandfather's youth. 6 days out, the shovel struck something that wasn't stone and wasn't clay at all. It was a curved slab of dressed limestone, too regular, too deliberately shaped to be anything but built by hand generations before. Emmett knelt and ran his fingers along the seam of it in the lantern light while Sula held the light steady above him. Neither one spoke. 3 days before the auction, with the redemption money still nowhere in sight and Whitcomb Dre already tacking the sale notice to the courthouse door in town, a spring storm rolled down out of the hills and settled in low and heavy over Tarrow County. The rain came sideways for 6 hours straight, drumming the tin roof so hard Alden couldn't sleep for the racket of it. Emmett lay awake beside Sula listening to the gutter's overflow, thinking of the open pit out in the barn, wondering if a night like this would undo every foot they dug. By first light, the whole hollow was running like a washtub, ditches full to the brim, the yard gone to standing water. Emmett pulled on his boots before coffee, dreading what he'd find, and walked out through the downpour toward the barn alone. He went out to check the barn, expecting ruin, and found something else entirely. The floor of his dig had given way overnight, not collapsed but opened. The dressed limestone slab tilted sideways under the pressure of rising water, and up through that gap, clear and cold and utterly unbothered by 100 years underground, ran a spring. It filled the pit to his shins in 20 minutes, clean as glass, smelling faintly of iron and something like peppermint, exactly the way his grandfather had always described it by the wood stove. Alden ran for his mother, shouting the whole way across the yard in the rain. Sula came at a run in her house dress, stopped cold at the barn door, and stood there a long moment with her hand over her mouth, staring down at water where no water had run in 70 years. Then she remembered something from a pamphlet years back about mineral springs and old health resorts scattered through that part of Kentucky before the automobile put them out of business, and she was gone again, running for the county extension office before the rain had even let up. By that afternoon, half of Tarrow County had come to stand at the barn door and stare down into the pit. Cordell Huck stood at the edge with his hat off, saying nothing for once in his life, watching the water run clear over the old limestone slab. Whitcomb Dre came too, notebook out, less interested in gossip now and more interested in old county surveys. He half remembered records of a chartered spring resort on that very parcel, decades before his own grandfather's time, records the bank's appraisal had never once accounted for. Within 2 days, a man from a bottling concern out of Lexington drove out himself, knelt at the edge of the pit, and tasted the water straight off his own cupped hand. He stood back up slowly, looked at Emmett, and made an offer for a lease on the spring that dwarfed the redemption amount by a wide, unembarrassed margin. He signed the papers right there at the kitchen table, the same table where Sula's numbers had refused to add up all winter long. The sheriff's sale never happened. Emmett paid the redemption in full on the 29th day, with 2 days left to spare, standing at the very same courthouse window where he'd once collected a certified letter meant to end everything he'd built. The clerk who stamped his receipt was not Whitcomb Dre, who by then had driven back out to the farm a third time, this time just to look at the water again, hat in his hand at the barn door like a man visiting something sacred. The barn still stands right where Ansel left it, though its floor never did get patched back over. Folks like to look down at the spring too much for that now. Tarrow County still talks about the week the Kesler place changed hands with nobody but the Keslers themselves, and calls it, half joking and half not, the year Ansel's water came home. Cordell Huck still stops by some evenings, just to fill a jug for his coffee, no longer laughing at the man he once called a groundhog. Emmett never did explain to anyone exactly why he trusted an old man's fireside story over a banker's certified letter. He didn't need to. The water explained it well enough on its own, running clear and cold under that barn to this very day, patient as it must have been all those buried years, like it had simply been waiting on someone stubborn enough to dig down and let it back up into the light.